There's a particular kind of person who unsettles others simply by existing. They're not hostile, not broken, not wounded in any obvious way. Yet when they enter a room, something shifts. They carry a quality that Carl Jung would have recognized immediately, a psychic density that makes manipulation impossible and pretense unbearable. These are the empath loners who keep no friends. And if you encounter one, you should pay very close attention. Not because they're dangerous in any conventional sense, but because they represent something that threatens every unconscious social dynamic you've ever participated in. They are individuals who have undergone what Jung called a complete psychic reorganization, who have descended into their own depths and returned fundamentally changed. They don't need your validation. They don't want your energy. And they can see through every mask you wear with an uncomfortable clarity. Most people who meet them experience one of two reactions: either profound discomfort that makes them want to leave the interaction immediately, or a strange recognition that this person knows something essential that they themselves have been running from their entire lives. Jung understood that loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself, or from holding certain views which others find inadmissible. The empath loner has crossed that threshold. They've stopped trying to translate their reality into a language that makes others comfortable. And that makes them one of the most psychologically sovereign individuals you'll ever meet. This isn't a story about isolation. It's a story about what happens when someone completes the journey Jung spent his entire life trying to map. Let's begin with what an empath loner actually is, because the term gets thrown around carelessly and most people fundamentally misunderstand what they're looking at. An empath loner is not simply a social outcast or wounded introvert, but someone who has fought an internal battle between perception and participation, sensitivity and survival, leading to a withdrawal from social bonds. This is not someone who couldn't make friends. This is someone who could, who did, and who then made a conscious or unconscious choice to stop. The distinction is critical. The empath loner typically begins their journey as what you might call a natural receiver. From childhood, they possess an uncanny ability to sense the emotional atmosphere of any space they entered. They could feel their mother's depression before she spoke a word. They knew when their father was angry, even when he smiled. They absorbed the tension in classrooms, the grief at funerals, the falseness at family gatherings. This wasn't a choice or a skill they developed. It was how their nervous system was wired. Modern neuroscience suggests that some individuals have hyperactive mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. In empaths, this mirroring system appears to be in overdrive, creating a lived experience where other people's emotions become indistinguishable from their own. Jung didn't have access to this neuroscience, but he understood the phenomenon through what he called participation mystique, a psychological state where the boundaries between self and other become blurred. For most people, this is a temporary state that occurs in moments of deep connection or intense emotion. For the empath, it's a baseline reality. They live in a state of chronic boundary permeability, where they cannot easily distinguish where they end and others begin. Now, here's where the journey toward becoming an empath loner truly begins. In childhood and early adulthood, most empaths don't recognize this permeability as unusual. They assume everyone experiences the world this way. So they do what comes naturally. They become helpers, fixers, emotional support systems for everyone around them. They're the friend people call at 3 a.m. They're the one who notices when someone is struggling and offers support before being asked. They're the mediator in family conflicts, the one who can see all sides and tries to hold space for everyone's pain. This role feels meaningful. It feels like purpose. The empath believes they're using their sensitivity for good, that their gift is meant to heal and help others. But something is happening beneath the surface that Jung would recognize as deeply problematic. The empath is not actually in relationship with these people. They're in relationship with their own compulsion to absorb and manage others' emotions. They're unconsciously trying to regulate their own nervous system by regulating everyone else's. If they can make everyone around them okay, then maybe they'll finally feel okay themselves. This is the wound masquerading as a gift, and it cannot be sustained indefinitely. Over time, a pattern emerges. The empath gives and gives and gives, pouring their energy into maintaining everyone else's emotional equilibrium. But something strange happens. The more they give, the more is demanded. People begin to treat the empath's availability as a given, their emotional labor as an unlimited resource. When the empath tries to set boundaries or take time for themselves, they're met with confusion, guilt-tripping, or accusations of selfishness. They hear phrases like, "You're the only one who understands me. I don't know what I'd do without you. Why are you being distant?" The empath, trained from childhood to prioritize others' feelings over their own needs, collapses these fragile boundaries and returns to the pattern of overgiving. Jung would identify this dynamic as a complex in action, specifically what we might call a savior complex or a caretaker complex. A complex is an autonomous part of the psyche that operates with its own agenda, often contrary to conscious intentions. The empath consciously wants healthy relationships, but their complex drives them to seek out people who need saving, who will drain them, who will keep them locked in the familiar dynamic of giving without receiving. This continues until something breaks. And what breaks is not the relationships, though those often end as well. What breaks is the empath's fundamental orientation to the world. They hit what Jung called an enantiodromia, a complete reversal of psychological attitude. The helper becomes unable to help. The giver becomes unable to give. The person who is always available suddenly disappears. This breaking point looks different for different individuals. For some, it's a health crisis. The body, which has been absorbing stress and emotion for years or decades, finally rebels. Chronic fatigue, autoimmune disorders, panic attacks, mysterious illnesses that doctors struggle to diagnose. The body is saying what the psyche couldn't, no more. For others, it's a single relationship that reveals the entire pattern with devastating clarity. Often this is a narcissistic relationship where the empath finally encounters someone whose emptiness cannot be filled, whose demands cannot be met, whose manipulation is so transparent that even the empath's tendency toward giving others the benefit of the doubt collapses. The empath sees clearly, perhaps for the first time, that they've been used. And not just by this one person, but by dozens, maybe hundreds of people throughout their life. They've been a supply source, an emotional dumping ground, a free therapist, a validation machine. They've confused boundary violation with intimacy, depletion with purpose, and their own absence of self with being a good person. This realization is shattering. It's not just grief over specific relationships. It's an existential crisis about their entire way of being in the world. Everything they thought made them valuable, their sensitivity, their availability, their capacity to help, now looks like a wound they've been bleeding from while everyone else held out cups to collect the blood. Jung understood this moment as the essential prerequisite for individuation. You cannot become who you actually are while you're busy being who everyone else needs you to be. The false self, constructed entirely around others' needs and expectations, must die before the true self can emerge. And for the empath, this death is experienced as a kind of psychic winter. They withdraw, not gradually, not with explanations or apologies, but suddenly and completely. Phone calls go unanswered. Text messages get brief, non-committal responses, or none at all. Social invitations are declined. The empath, who was once the center of their social circle, the glue holding everyone together, simply vanishes. And this is when they become the empath loner. The people in their former life react predictably. Some are hurt and confused, genuinely not understanding what happened. Others are angry, offended that their emotional support system has shut down without warning. Some try to guilt the empath back into relationship, sending messages about how much they're missed, how things aren't the same without them, subtle or overt pressures designed to reactivate the old caretaking dynamic. A few, the truly unconscious ones, don't even notice the empath is gone until they need something and realize their usual resource is no longer available. The empath loner sees all of this with new clarity that's both liberating and devastating. They understand now that most of what they call friendship was actually a transactional arrangement where they provided emotional labor in exchange for the illusion of belonging. Now we arrive at the aspect that makes people wary, the aspect Jung would call dangerous in the most profound sense. In a psychological sense, the integrated loner is dangerous because the usual levers of social manipulation stop working. The empath loner has developed what we might call psychological immunity. They can no longer be guilt, manipulated, love-bombed, or pressured back into unconscious patterns. This isn't because they become cold or hard. It's because they become conscious. They've made the unconscious conscious. To use Jung's central formula, and that consciousness makes them impervious to the subtle and not-so-subtle manipulations that govern most social interaction. Let's be specific about what this looks like. The empath loner can feel when someone is trying to extract something from them. They sense the subtle expectation behind a casual question. They recognize when someone's friendliness is actually a setup for a request. They know the difference between genuine interest and the performance of interest that precedes a demand. And unlike their former self, who would have overridden this knowing and given anyway, the empath loner simply declines. They don't explain. They don't justify. They don't soften the no with elaborate apologies or offer alternatives. They just say no, I can't, or sometimes just no. This is experienced by others as cold, harsh, selfish. But from a Jungian perspective, this is the emergence of healthy ego boundaries after a lifetime of boundary dissolution. The empath is finally differentiating from the collective, finally claiming sovereignty over their own psyche and energy. They're learning a truth that Jung understood deeply, that solitude is not just acceptable, but essential for psychological development. Jung wrote that the highest and most decisive experience of all is to be alone with one's own self, or whatever else one chooses to call the objectivity of the psyche, and that only this experience can give an individual an indestructible foundation. The empath loner is living this truth, not as philosophy but as necessity. They've discovered that the psyche has its own intelligence, its own self-protective mechanisms. And one of those mechanisms is the impulse towards solitude when connection has become toxic. But let's address the question that's probably arising. Is this healthy, or is this just another form of wounding? Is the empath loner actually individuating in the Jungian sense, or are they just hiding from life? This is where we need to distinguish between isolation and solitude, between withdrawal as defense and withdrawal as transformation. Isolation is disconnection from self and others, a numbing out, a shutting down of the psychic system. It's characterized by inner emptiness, by a sense of meaninglessness, by depression and stagnation. Someone in isolation isn't engaged with their inner world. They're just trying not to feel. Solitude, by contrast, is active engagement with one's own psyche. Jung suggested that periods of isolation aren't just empty spaces, but can be profoundly meaningful parts of inner development, moments when life gently nudges us toward deeper self-understanding. The person in solitude is doing the work that can only be done alone, confronting their shadow, dialoguing with their unconscious, integrating the disowned parts of themselves. The empath loner is, ideally, in solitude rather than isolation. They're using this period of withdrawal to answer questions they could never address while they were busy managing everyone else's emotions. Who am I when I'm not required to carry others? What do I actually want versus what I've been conditioned to want? Where do my feelings end and others begin? What are my authentic values versus the values I've absorbed from family, culture, and the people I was trying to help? These are not intellectual exercises. They're lived experiences that require time, space, and absence of external demands. The empath loner is conducting a kind of psychological archaeology, excavating the true self that's been buried under layers of adaptation and other people's expectations. Now, Jung was clear that this process of individuation, of becoming truly oneself, is not comfortable. He repeatedly experienced the isolation that comes with greater consciousness, with knowing more than those around him, noting that while the experience was not pleasant, it came with great benefits, especially strength, authenticity, creativity, and growth. The empath loner is experiencing the same isolation of consciousness. They know things now that most people either don't know or actively avoid knowing. They know that most relationships are unconscious arrangements where people use each other to avoid facing themselves. They know that what passes for intimacy is often just mutual ego stroking or mutual avoidance of the void. They know that the social world is largely built on performance, persona, and a collective agreement not to look too closely at what's actually happening beneath the surface. And once you know these things, you cannot unknow them. You cannot go back to unconscious participation in the social game. You can only choose whether to pretend you don't see what you see, or to honor your vision, even if it means standing alone. The empath loner has chosen the latter. They've decided that authentic solitude is preferable to inauthentic connection. This is not antisocial personality disorder. This is not schizoid withdrawal. This is a conscious choice made from a place of hard-won self-knowledge. They're not afraid of people. They're not incapable of connection. They're simply unwilling to betray themselves anymore by participating in relationships that require them to be less than fully themselves. Let's explore what's actually happening during this extended period of having no friends, because from the outside it looks like nothing, like stagnation or depression or giving up. But from a Jungian perspective, this is the most intensive period of psychological work a person can undertake. The empath loner is engaging in what Jung called active imagination, a practice of consciously dialoguing with the unconscious contents of the psyche. They're meeting the characters of their inner world, the parts of themselves that have been split off and projected onto others. They might encounter their inner critic, that voice that sounds like a parent or teacher or ex-partner, and realize it's actually a part of themselves that they've internalized. They might meet their shadow, all the qualities they denied and repressed because they didn't fit the image of the good, selfless empath. Anger, selfishness, cruelty, indifference, all the human qualities they've split off are now demanding integration. This shadow work is particularly intense for empaths because their entire identity has been built around being good, caring, sensitive, always there for others. To integrate the shadow means acknowledging that they're also capable of not caring, of being selfish, of wanting to hurt people who've hurt them. These shadow elements aren't defects to be eliminated. They're essential parts of wholeness that have been exiled. Jung was clear that you cannot become whole by only accepting your light side. You must embrace the darkness as well. The empath loner is doing this work in solitude because it cannot be done while managing others' reactions to their shadow. If they express anger, people call them toxic. If they set boundaries, people call them selfish. If they stop caring, people call them heartless. So they stop sharing this process with others and instead go deep into their own psychic underworld to wrestle with these demons alone. Another crucial aspect of this period is what Jung called withdrawal projections. Throughout their life, the empath has been projecting aspects of their own psyche onto others. They saw in other people what they couldn't see in themselves. They found their own strength in helping others be strong. They experienced their own worthiness through being needed. They felt their own power through being the one others depended on. Now, in solitude, these projections are being systematically withdrawn and integrated. The empath is discovering that the strength they thought they were giving others was actually their own. The wisdom they thought they were channeling for others was their own. The power they experienced through being needed was actually the power of their own being that they'd never claimed directly. This is a profound shift. It's the difference between experiencing yourself as a conduit for something outside yourself versus recognizing yourself as the source. The empath loner is becoming the source. They're recognizing that everything they thought they were providing for others exists within themselves, for themselves. And this recognition is both liberating and terrifying, because it means taking full responsibility for their own psychic life, rather than living vicariously through their impact on others. There's also a spiritual dimension to this process that Jung would recognize. The empath loner is often undergoing what mystics call the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual desolation where all former sources of meaning have dried up. The meaning they derive from helping others is gone. The identity they build around being needed is gone. The sense of purpose that came from being the strong one for everyone else is gone. They're in a void, and Jung would say this void is necessary. It's the space where the ego's attachment to external sources of meaning must be relinquished before connection to the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, can be established. During this dark night, the empath loner may experience what feels like complete meaninglessness. They might question whether life has any purpose at all, whether connection is even possible, whether they'll ever feel anything again besides this flat, empty neutrality. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can look similar. This is what Jung called a necessary disintegration that precedes reintegration at a higher level. The old structure of meaning has collapsed. The new one hasn't yet emerged. And the empath must sit in this uncomfortable space without prematurely constructing a new false self to escape the discomfort. Now, let's address the word beware in the title, because it's not accidental and it's not clickbait. There's a genuine sense in which the empath loner becomes someone that unconscious people need to be wary of, not because they'll harm them, but because they won't play along anymore. Think about how most social interaction works. It's based on unspoken agreements, mutual performance, tacit understandings about what won't be said or acknowledged. Person A performs interest and concern. Person B reciprocates. Neither looks too closely at whether the interest is genuine or whether the concern is just social lubrication. The empath loner has stopped participating in this dance. When you ask them how they are, they might say fine, or they might say I don't want to answer that question, or they might just not respond. When you perform friendliness toward them, expecting the usual social reciprocation, you might get a level of honesty that's unsettling. They're not rude, exactly. They're just not performing. And that non-performance reveals a performance of everyone else. This makes people uncomfortable. It holds up a mirror to the inauthenticity of conventional social interaction. And most people don't want to look in that mirror. They'd rather believe the performance is real, that their friendships are genuine, that their social connections are meaningful. The empath loner's very presence challenges that comfortable illusion. Section 11. There's also the matter of what Jung called psychic contagion. The empath loner, having done deep work with their own shadow, having integrated the sown part of themselves, having achieved a degree of psychological wholeness that's rare, carries a particular psychic frequency, and that frequency can be deeply disturbing to people who are still unconscious. On an unconscious level, people can sense that this person sees them clearly, sees through the personas and defenses, sees the shadow material they're busy denying and projecting. This is experienced as threatening even though the empath loner may not be doing anything overt. They're just being present in their wholeness, and that wholeness confronts others with their own fragmentation. So people react. Some become hostile, try and provoke a reaction to pull the empath loner back into drama and emotional engagement. Others become clingy, sensing that this person has something they need and trying to extract it. Still others simply avoid the empath loner, finding excuses not to be around them because their presence generates too much internal discomfort. The empath loner typically responds to all of these reactions with the same basic stance, calm disengagement. They're not interested in converting anyone, explaining themselves, or proving anything. They've moved beyond the need for external validation. And that's perhaps the most dangerous thing about them from the perspective of the unconscious collective. They become immune to the primary social control mechanisms, approval and disapproval. You cannot control someone who doesn't need your approval. You cannot manipulate someone who's not afraid of your disapproval. The empath loner has discovered an internal locus of validation. They've learned to approve of themselves, to trust their own perceptions, to value their own company. This makes them, in Jung's sense, individuated to a significant degree. They're no longer an unconscious part of the collective psyche. They're a separate, sovereign individual. Now, a crucial question arises. Is the empath loner meant to stay in solitude forever? Is this the end point of their journey, or is it a transitional phase? Jung would say it's transitional, but not in the way most people hope. The goal isn't to fix the empath loner, so they can return to normal social functioning. The goal is for them to complete their transformation so they can engage in conscious relationship rather than unconscious enmeshment. There's a world of difference between these two modes. Unconscious relationship is what the empath experienced before. It's based on projection, on need, on unconscious agreements to stabilize each other's unresolved complexes. It's characterized by drama, boundary violation, emotional volatility, and the inability to distinguish self from other. Conscious relationship, by contrast, is based on two individuated people choosing to connect while maintaining their separateness. Jung expressed this beautifully in a letter to Rainer Maria Rilke, which Rilke then adapted into his own words. Jung held that the highest task of a bond between two people was that each should stand guard over the solitude of the other, and that love and friendship existed for the purpose of continually providing the opportunity for solitude. This is a kind of relationship the empath loner might eventually choose to engage in. Not relationship based on need or rescuing or filling each other's voids, but relationship based on mutual recognition of sovereignty, on respect for each other's separateness, on the capacity to be together without losing oneself. But this kind of relationship is exceedingly rare. It requires both people to have done significant inner work, to have integrated their shadows, to have established clear ego boundaries, to have developed an internal source of validation and meaning. Most people haven't done this work and have no interest in doing it. So the empath loner social circle, if and when they choose to have one, becomes very small and very selective. They're no longer interested in quantity of connections. They're interested in quality, in depth, in relationships that honor rather than violate psychological boundaries. They might have one or two friends, people who've also done the work, who can meet them in that space of conscious relating. Or they might continue to have no close friends, finding that their relationship with their own psyche, with nature, with creative work, with the numinous, is more fulfilling than most human relationships. Jung himself lived this way. Despite being a public figure with colleagues in Analysans, he maintained a tower in Bollingen where he would retreat for extended periods of solitude. Jung wrote that loneliness was for him a source of healing that made his life worth living, that talking was often a torment, and that he needed several days of silence to recover from the futility of words. The empath loner is discovering this same truth. Words, especially words in conventional social interaction, feel futile because they're mostly used to maintain personas and avoid real contact. Silence, solitude, the inner dialogue with the deeper layers of psyche, this is where real communication happens. This is where meaning is found. Now, there's a paradox that Jung understood well. The more individuated you become, the more you can truly connect with others. But the more you can truly connect, the less interested you become in superficial connection. So the individuated person, the empath loner who's completed their transformation, becomes both more capable of profound intimacy and less interested in casual relationship. They've learned that their psychic energy is finite and precious. They've learned that every interaction has a cost, and they become very discerning about where they invest that energy. This looks like coldness to people who expect empaths to be endlessly available and caring, but it's actually wisdom. It's the wisdom of someone who's learned through painful experience that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and that most people aren't looking for genuine connection anyway. They're looking for supply. Let's discuss what happens when unconscious people encounter an empath loner and try to engage them using old patterns. The results are usually instructive for anyone watching. Someone might approach the empath loner with a problem, expecting the old caretaking response. The empath loner listens, perhaps, but doesn't offer the expected soothing or problem-solving. They might say something like, "That sounds difficult," or "What are you to do about that?" Or sometimes just a neutral acknowledgement that doesn't invite further emotional dumping. The person is left holding their own problem, which is a point all along, but feels like rejection because they're so used to the empath carrying it for them. Someone might try to create drama, starting a conflict or stirring up emotional intensity, expecting the empath loner to get pulled in, to defend themselves, to engage. The empath loner doesn't. They might simply remove themselves from the situation or respond with such calm neutrality that the drama has nowhere to go. It's like trying to start a fire with wet wood. The fuel just won't ignite. Someone might attempt manipulation, guilt-tripping about how much they miss the old version of the empath, how the empath has changed and not in a good way, how they're not the caring person they used to be. The empath loner recognizes this for what it is, an attempt to reactivate old programming. They don't defend themselves or explain. They might say something like, "I hear that you're uncomfortable with my boundaries," or "I'm sorry you feel that way," both of which are non-apologies that maintain the boundary while acknowledging the other person's experience. In all of these scenarios, what's happening is that the empath loner is refusing to participate in unconscious relationship dynamics. They're not meeting manipulation with counter-manipulation. They're not meeting drama with drama. They're not meeting need with rescue. They're simply being present in their own sovereignty and letting others be responsible for their own psychic content. This is what Jung meant when he said that individuation makes you capable of true relationship. You can only truly meet another person when you're not entangled with them, not trying to fix them, not using them to avoid yourself. The empath loner has learned this lesson in the hardest possible way, and they've decided that no relationship is better than unconscious relationship. This brings us to the final piece of understanding the empath loner from a Jungian perspective. What is the ultimate purpose of this journey? What's the point of all the solitude and shadow work and withdrawal from social connection? Jung would say the purpose is the development of the self, capital S. The self in Jungian psychology is not the ego, not the conscious sense of I. The self is the archetype of wholeness, the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, the organizing principle that guides the individuation process. Most people live their entire lives identified with the ego, with the conscious personality, with the persona they present to the world. They never make contact with the self. They never experience the deeper organizing intelligence that exists beyond ego consciousness. The empath loner, through their journey of solitude and shadow integration, is making contact with the self. They're learning to distinguish between the voice of ego, which is concerned with survival and social acceptance, and the voice of self, which is concerned with wholeness and authentic expression. This contact with the self is what gives the empath loner their unshakable quality. They're no longer operating purely from ego, from the need to be liked or accepted or validated. They're operating from a deeper place that Jung sometimes called the inner voice or the voice of nature. And that voice doesn't care about social approval. It cares about truth, about alignment, about living in accordance with one's deepest nature rather than in accordance with collective expectations. There's a final dimension to the empath loner that recent psychological work has begun to articulate with stunning clarity, what's now being called the sovereign empath archetype. This represents a completed transformation, the actualized endpoint of the journey we've been tracing. And understanding this archetype reveals why the empath loner is not just psychologically immune, but actively catalytic in ways that can fundamentally alter the consciousness of those around them. The sovereign empath has achieved something Jung considered the pinnacle of psychological development, the ability to make their sensitivity conscious rather than remaining its unconscious victim. They've moved from what Jung would recognize as passive absorption to active discernment. They've learned to feel with someone while consciously maintaining the absolute separation of their inner world from others. This is not coldness or detachment. It's mastery. Think of it this way. The unconscious empath is like someone with perfect pitch who's overwhelmed by every sound, who can't enter a crowded room without being assaulted by a cacophony they can't control or filter. The sovereign empath has learned to use that same perfect pitch as a diagnostic tool, hearing the notes precisely, but choosing which ones to harmonize with and which to simply observe. Jung understood that empaths tap into the collective unconscious, that shared reservoir of human experience containing primal patterns and ancestral memory. The problem for most empaths is that they mistake these collective waves of emotion for personal experiences. They feel a generalized anxiety rippling through humanity and absorb it as their own anxiety disorder. They sense historical trauma patterns and carry them as personal wounds. The sovereign empath has developed what we might call a psychological immune system. They recognize collective emotional energy as data, as information about the human condition, but they refuse to let it define their individual experience. They can feel the weight of intergenerational trauma without being crushed by it. They can sense the collective shadow without being possessed by it. Now here's what makes the sovereign empath particularly powerful and why their presence unsettles those still operating unconsciously. Jung maintained that the empath is not a healer, but an awakener, someone who can feel the residual emotions of generations. But the sovereign empath takes us further. Their being becomes three things simultaneously: a mirror to reflect what others cannot yet name, a magnet to draw from people what is hidden, and a map to model the journey from unconscious fusion to sovereign presence. This is why people react so strongly to the empath loner. In their presence, you cannot hide. Not because they're interrogating you or calling you out, but because their very consciousness creates a field of coherence that makes pretense exhausting. They've integrated their own shadow so thoroughly that your unintegrated shadow becomes visible by contrast. They've withdrawn their projections so completely that your projections have nowhere to land. You're forced to see yourself clearly, and for most people, that's deeply uncomfortable. The sovereign empath has also developed what might be called shadow immunity. They've learned to recognize manipulation tactics before they take hold, not through intellectual analysis, but through somatic knowing, through a body-level recognition that says this energy pattern is familiar and I no longer participate in it. This is what makes them dangerous to toxic systems and manipulative individuals. The usual hooks don't work. The guilt trips bounce off. The love bombing is recognized immediately for what it is. The gaslighting creates no confusion because a sovereign empath trusts their own perception more than they fear your disapproval. They've discovered what Jung knew, that silence can be a boundary, and for the empath, boundaries are sacred milestones. Their quiet exit from relationships, from jobs, from social circles isn't avoidance or weakness. It's the soul gathering its pieces, the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all parts of the psyche, especially the ones we've denied. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the sovereign empath is their role in collective transformation. Jung believed individual consciousness evolution affects the entire system. When one person becomes conscious, the entire web shifts, and the empath's journey echoes through generations as a turning point, a refusal to carry the wound any further. This is particularly significant because many empaths are carrying transgenerational complexes, psychic knots that repeat across time until someone becomes conscious of them. They're often born into lineages marked by silence, repression, addiction, betrayal, or emotional abandonment, becoming the sensitive ones who absorb what others deny. When the empath completes their journey to sovereignty, when they hand back what was never theirs to hold, they're not just healing themselves. They're breaking ancestral patterns. They're liberating future generations from having to carry these unintegrated shadows. And this is where the empath loner's choice to have no friends takes on an almost sacred dimension. They're not antisocial or damaged. They're conducting what amounts to psychic surgery on themselves and, by extension, on their entire lineage. And this work cannot be done while managing others' reactions, soothing others' discomfort, or performing normalcy for a collective that remains unconscious. The sovereign empath has also made a crucial discovery that Jung articulated beautifully. Empathy is not an obligation. It's a gift and a power, and when rooted in self-awareness, it can build bridges and heal wounds. But when driven by guilt, fear, or identity, it becomes a trap. The empath loner has escaped that trap. They've stopped wielding their empathy as proof of their worth or as a strategy to earn love. They recognize it as simply one aspect of their being, valuable when used consciously, destructive when it uses them. And here's the final twist that brings us full circle to why you should beware of the empath loner. The more integrated they become, the more capable they are of genuine intimacy, but the less interested they are in anything less than that. They're moving from raw sensitivity to psychic integrity, an ability to sense others while staying rooted in self. And people who can do this are exceedingly rare. So when the empath loner finally does choose to connect, when they decide someone is worthy of their time and energy, that connection will be unlike anything most people have experienced. It will be what Jung described as a highest form relationship, where each person stands guard over the solitude of the other, where love exists to continually provide opportunity for sovereignty rather than to dissolve boundaries. But getting there requires that the empath loner first complete their withdrawal, their cocoon phase, their journey into the depths of their own psyche. They must become sovereign before they can meet another sovereign. They must integrate their shadow before they can witness another's without judgment. They must establish an unshakable sense of self before they can risk genuine intimacy that doesn't threaten that self. The empath loner, keeping no friends, is not the tragic end of the story. It's the necessary middle, the chrysalis stage where the most profound transformation occurs. And those who understand this, who can honor rather than pathologize it, who can wait without demanding or pressuring, those rare individuals might eventually be invited into the inner circle of someone who has completed one of the most difficult psychological journeys a human can undertake. That invitation, if it ever comes, will be the highest compliment you could receive, because it means the sovereign empath has looked into your psyche with their penetrating clarity and determined that you, too, are doing the work, that you, too, value truth over comfort, that you, too, can meet them in that space of conscious relating where both people remain whole. Closing and disclaimer. So when you encounter an empath loner who keeps no friends, understand that you're encountering someone who has completed a journey most people never begin. They've descended into their own psychological underworld, confronted their shadow, integrated disowned parts of themselves, withdrawn projections, established firm boundaries, and made contact with the organizing principle of their deeper psyche. They're not damaged. They're not antisocial. They're not in need of fixing. They're simply awake in a way that makes unconscious social dynamics impossible. You should beware of them not because they'll harm you, but because they won't participate in the subtle manipulations and unconscious transactions that most relationships are built on. They'll see you clearly, probably more clearly than you see yourself. And they'll choose whether to engage with you based on whether that engagement serves their own wholeness, not based on guilt or obligation or the need to be liked. If you can meet them in that place of consciousness, if you've done your own work and can engage a relationship while maintaining sovereignty, then you might find in the empath loner the rarest thing in human experience. Someone who can truly see you and be seen by you without the usual veils and performances and defenses. But if you're still unconscious, still operating from unintegrated complexes and unacknowledged shadow, the empath loner will feel threatening. And they should, because their very existence is a challenge to every unconscious pattern, every manipulative dynamic, every inauthentic interaction you participate in. They've found what Jung spent his life pointing toward, the courage to be completely oneself regardless of what that costs in terms of social acceptance. And once someone has found that, they can never go back to pretending. They can only stand in their truth and let others choose whether to meet them there or walk away. This content is provided for educational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The concepts discussed are drawn from Jungian analytical psychology and contemporary understanding of highly sensitive individuals. If you are experiencing difficulties with relationships, social isolation, or mental health concerns, please seek support from a qualified mental health professional. The term empath describes individuals with heightened sensitivity to emotional environments and is not a clinical diagnosis. Individual experiences vary, and professional guidance is essential for personal circumstances.